This video is brought to you by Nebula. For the past few days, the UK has been gripped by violent anti-immigrant riots after the stabbing of 3 young girls in the northern English town of Southport, which was followed by a slew of social media posts falsely claiming the perpetrator was a Muslim asylum seeker. While Prime Minister Keir Starmer quickly signalled that he would be taking a hardline stance towards the riots, warning of swift and strict sentences, at the time of writing, violence is continuing to spiral as rioters square off against counter-protesters, who have apparently also resorted to violence on at least one occasion. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the unrest that's currently engulfing the UK, why it's so difficult for the government, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Anyway, caveats aside, we're going to structure this video by going through the events of the past few weeks chronologically, and then explain why it puts the government in a difficult spot. You might think it would be natural to start this story with the attacks we saw in Southport last week, because that's been the immediate trigger of the riots we've seen over the last couple of days. But the UK has actually been struggling with higher than usual amounts of civil unrest for most of July, and this has played into the riots we've seen over the last couple of days. On July the 19th, riots broke out in East London between 2 groups of Bangladeshi men, who were on different sides of the ongoing protests in Bangladesh. Police tried to intervene, but ended up getting caught in the crossfire, and 2 officers were injured. In the same day, riots broke out in Leeds after social workers and police took 4 Roma children into care. Their removal was resisted by both the family and the local community, and riots broke out that evening, with a bus set on fire and a police car overturned. There was then further unrest for the next 2 nights, and in the end West Yorkshire Police just withdrew, claiming that their presence was actually fueling the unrest. Then, a couple of days later, on July the 25th, there were anti-police protests in Manchester after footage released on social media showed a police officer kicking a 19-year-old man, Mohammed Fahir, in the face as he lay prone on the ground. The protest didn't turn violent, but the police were forced to barricade themselves into the station. CCTV footage released a week or so later would show that the man assaulted the police beforehand. We mention these events because many figures on the right or far right of the British political spectrum, including perhaps most notably the founder of the anti-Islam English Defence League, Tommy Robinson, were already complaining before the Southport attacks that this upsurge in unrest was proof that the police had, in some sense, lost control, or engaging in what's sometimes called two-tier policing. Basically, two-tier policing is a theory that the UK police treat certain groups more generously than others. This became a real talking point in right-wing circles after October the 7th, when various commentators argued that the police were being more lenient towards pro-Palestine protesters than the counter-protesters. Certain commentators started claiming that the police's apparent passivity in these recent events was proof that the so-called white working class are policed especially harshly. So, you get the point. Parts of the far right were already angry before the Southport attacks on July the 29th, when a 17-year-old male killed 3 young girls between the ages of 6 and 9 and stabbed 10 other people. Even though it later emerged that the perpetrator was born in the UK to Rwandan immigrants, a false rumour quickly started circulating online that he was a Muslim asylum seeker called Ali al-Shakati, which was apparently started by a Russian-linked fake news website and then propagated by Russia Today, Russia's state-owned news network. The day after the attacks, far-right groups descended on the town and immediately attacked a mosque in the town centre. Again, despite the fact that the attacker had no known links to Islam, and despite the fact that their presence was opposed by most of the local community, as evidenced by comments by the victims' parents who asked rioters to stop, and the vast number of locals who turned up to help rebuild the mosque the next morning. When the police intervened, the rioters turned on them, injuring 53 officers and setting fire to a police van. These far-right riots then spread to cities across the UK, including London, Belfast and Manchester. While the number involved in these riots have so far been pretty limited, most of them had well under 1,000 people, the violence incurred has been unprecedented. A hotel housing asylum seekers in Rotherham was set alight. Nearly 100 police officers have been injured, and over 250 people have so far been arrested. Even politicians that you might expect to be more sympathetic to the riots have been spooked by their scale. Nigel Farage, for instance, who was accused of fueling the unrest after he suggested the state was, quote, withholding information in the aftermath of the Southport attacks, released a statement on Monday describing the violence as appalling and even floated deploying the army to reinstate the peace. Worryingly, the riots have invited counter-protests. Some of these have been peaceful, but some of them, in places like Blackburn, have turned violent, which risks creating a vicious cycle, where rioters respond to violence by counter-protesters with more violence ad infinitum. So what can the government do here? Well, in a speech on Thursday, Starmer signalled that he'd be taking a hardline stance against the protesters, promising harsh sentences, a new anti-riot police task force, and possibly criminal behaviour orders to restrict the movement of rioters, as happened with football hooligans. This is unsurprising, given Starmer oversaw the sentencing of rioters after the London riots in 2011, and it's probably the government's best chance at quelling the unrest. However, there are two caveats worth mentioning here. First, as we mentioned in our other videos, the UK genuinely doesn't have that many prison spaces left, and if the government wants to incarcerate thousands of rioters, it'll need to release other inmates. Second, if counter-protests turn violent, Starmer will have to make sure that the law is seen to be applied consistently. If it's not, this will only fuel talk of two-tier policing on the right, and possibly even fuel further riots. But even once the violence has been quelled, Starmer will still be left with a whole load of more difficult long-term questions to answer, relating to disinformation on social media, the renewed threat of the far right in the UK, the political risks of the UK's current immigration policies, and the ongoing prisons crisis. Keep diving deeper into this and other news stories over on Nebula, where the TLDR team curates the most important news videos from around the world, saving you from a deluge of bad news and helping you pay attention to what really matters. That means no more feeling out of touch. On Nebula News, the TLDR team acts as your guide through the media landscape, sharing the news we're paying attention to, helping you find stories that matter, and avoiding burnout. If you don't know already, Nebula is the streaming service that we co-own with a bunch of your favourite creators. There you can watch original content like Real Life Law's incredible series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, then click the link in the description to sign up now. If you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. Plus, Nebula will know you came from us, which really helps us out. We've got some really great feedback from existing members, so I hope you enjoy all the effort we're going to with Nebula News.